There is something your soulmate finally understands about the moment you walked away, and the truth has been sitting in their mind like a question they cannot silence. They used to believe you left because you stopped caring. They told themselves you became distant, cold, difficult, or maybe you simply found a reason to move on. That explanation made things easier for them. If you stopped loving them, then they did not have to ask what they did wrong. They did not have to replay the conversations. They did not have to remember the moments when you were still trying, while they were already taking your presence for granted. But something has changed now. Your absence has started speaking in a way your presence never could. They are remembering the way you looked at them before you finally became quiet. They are remembering the conversations you tried to have, the questions you asked, the moments when you were clearly hurting but still stayed. And now a realization is slowly breaking through the story they created about you. You did not walk away because your feelings disappeared. You walked away because you were tired of carrying a connection that was slowly becoming heavier than your heart could hold. Imagine someone standing beside a lighthouse every night, never truly noticing the light because it is always there. Then one evening, the light disappears, and suddenly the darkness reveals what that light had been protecting them from all along. That is what your absence did. It forced them to see what your presence allowed them to ignore. And now they are asking themselves the question they tried to avoid for far too long. How long were you hurting before you finally decided that loving them could no longer mean losing yourself? And now they are beginning to understand the part that hurts the most. They thought you walked away because you wanted to punish them. They thought your silence was a game. Your distance was an attempt to make them chase you, or your sudden change meant that someone else had taken your place. That explanation was easier to live with because it allowed them to believe that your departure was simply a choice you made one day. But the truth is much harder to accept. You did not leave at the moment you stopped loving them. You left at the moment you realized that loving them was slowly costing you your peace. And now, when they look back, certain moments are beginning to look completely different. The conversations they once dismissed now feel important. The questions you ask now sound like warnings. The times you became quiet now seem less like anger and more like exhaustion. They are starting to understand that you were not suddenly cold. You were slowly becoming tired of being the only one trying to keep something alive. Imagine holding a door open for someone you love, waiting for them to walk through, while your hands are slowly beginning to bleed from the weight of it. You keep holding because you believe they will eventually notice. You keep waiting because you believe they will eventually understand. But after a while you have to let go. Not because you stopped wanting them to enter, but because you finally realized that you were the only one holding the door open. That is what they are beginning to understand about you now. You were not asking for perfection. You were not asking them to read your mind. You were not demanding impossible things. You were asking for something much simpler: effort, honesty, consistency, a reason to believe that you were not alone inside a connection that was supposed to belong to both of you. And maybe they did not understand how serious it had become because you kept trying to remain strong. You smiled when you were disappointed. You stayed quiet when you wanted to ask difficult questions. You accepted less than you deserved because a part of you kept hoping that one day they would finally see what you were giving. But people often misunderstand the person who keeps forgiving them. They assume patience has no limit. They assume love will always return. They assume the person who stayed through everything will stay forever. And then one day, something inside you becomes quiet. Not angry, not dramatic, just finished. That is the part they never expected. They expected a final argument. They expected tears, accusations, a dramatic goodbye, something they could point to and say, that was the moment everything ended. But you did not give them that. You simply began to disappear emotionally before you ever disappeared physically. And by the time you finally walked away, you had already fought the battle inside yourself 100 times. You didn't leave because you stopped caring, is the truth they are slowly being forced to face. You left because caring alone was no longer enough to keep you there. That realization is changing the way they remember everything. They are looking back at the moments when you needed reassurance but pretended you were fine. They are remembering how many times you tried to communicate without making them feel attacked. They are realizing that maybe you were not asking them to become someone else. Maybe you were simply asking them to meet you halfway. And the painful question now sitting in their mind is this: how many times did you try to tell them you were hurting before you finally understood that they were not listening? Because the truth is, you may have walked away from the relationship long before they realized you were leaving. They only saw the final step. They never saw all the steps that came before it. They saw the silence, but not the conversations you had with yourself. They saw the distance, but not the countless times you tried to stay close. They saw you let go, but they never saw how tightly you had been holding on. And now, for the first time, they may be beginning to understand that your goodbye was not a sudden decision. It was the final page of a story you had been trying to rewrite for a very long time. But what they still do not understand is why, even after walking away, your energy continues to return to their thoughts when everything around them becomes quiet. And this is where the connection begins to haunt them in a way they never expected. Because walking away was supposed to create distance, but somehow your absence has made you impossible to forget. They may have told themselves that time would make everything easier. They may have believed that if they stayed busy enough, surrounded themselves with enough noise, enough people, enough distractions, the memory of you would eventually become less intense. But that is not what happened. Instead, you keep appearing in the quiet moments they never planned for. A song plays, and suddenly they remember you. They pass a familiar place, and for a second, the past feels closer than the present. Someone says a phrase you used to say, and their mind immediately returns to you before they can stop it. They may not even understand why it happens. They can go through an entire day without consciously thinking about you, and then one small thing opens the door again. A memory, a look, a conversation, a dream, and suddenly they are back in the same emotional space they thought they had already left behind. Imagine closing a book before reaching the final page. You can place it on a shelf, walk away, and pretend the story is over, but somewhere in the back of your mind, one question continues repeating itself. What happened next? That is what this connection feels like to them now. The story ended physically, but emotionally something remained unfinished. They keep returning to the same moments, searching for the place where everything changed. They replay the last conversations and wonder whether they missed something. They remember your silence and ask themselves what you were really feeling. They remember the way you looked at them and wonder if that was the moment you already knew you were going to leave. And the more they think about it, the more complicated the truth becomes, because they are not only missing your presence, they are missing the way they felt when they were with you. You saw parts of them that they rarely showed anyone else. You noticed the things hidden behind their confidence. You understood the silence behind their words. You could sense when something was wrong, even when they insisted everything was fine. And now they may be realizing that not everyone sees them that way. Not everyone understands the things they never say. Not everyone remembers the details they thought nobody noticed. That is why replacing you has not been as simple as they expected. They may have met new people. They may have tried to move forward. They may have even convinced themselves that they were completely fine. But every new connection seems to remind them of something that was different about you. And that comparison is not always intentional. It simply happens. Someone does not understand them the way you did. Someone reacts differently. Someone misses the details you would have noticed immediately. And suddenly, without warning, their mind returns to you. They may ask themselves, did I lose someone I will never find again? And that question is becoming harder for them to ignore, because there is a difference between missing someone and realizing that you may have lost access to them permanently. Before, they may have believed that if they ever wanted to return, you would still be waiting somewhere in the same emotional place. But now they are beginning to wonder if that is still true. They are beginning to wonder whether you have finally learned how to live without them. And that thought changes everything. Because what if the person they assumed would always be there has finally stopped looking back? What if your silence is no longer temporary? What if your distance is not a test, not a phase, not an attempt to make them chase you, but the result of a decision you made deep inside yourself? This is the part that keeps them thinking about you late at night, when the distractions disappear and there is nowhere left to hide from their own thoughts. They are not simply asking whether you still remember them. They are asking whether you still have space for them in the life you began building after you walked away. And the most painful realization may be this: they are beginning to understand that while they were assuming you would always be emotionally available, you were slowly learning how to become completely whole without them. And this is the part they can feel, even if they cannot explain it. Something about you has changed since you walked away. They may not know exactly when it happened, and they may not have the words to describe it, but they can sense that you are no longer standing in the same emotional place where they left you. Before, they may have believed that you were still waiting. They may have assumed that no matter how much time passed, no matter how distant things became, some part of you would remain available to them. They thought they could return whenever they were ready. They thought the door would always be open because you had opened it so many times before. But now, something feels different. Your energy is quieter. Your presence feels farther away. You are no longer reaching for answers that never came. You are no longer checking for signs in every message, every silence, every sudden change. You may still remember them. You may still care about them. But you are no longer allowing the connection to control your peace. And that is the shift they are beginning to feel. Imagine a radio station that once broadcast the same signal every day. Someone could tune in whenever they wanted, knowing the frequency would always be there. Then one day, the signal changes. The station has not disappeared. It has simply moved to a frequency they no longer know how to find. That is what your transformation feels like to them. You did not become a different person because you stopped caring. You became a different person because you finally started caring about yourself too. And that is something they may not have expected. They may have been comfortable with the version of you who explained everything, forgave everything, waited through everything, and continued giving even when you were receiving very little in return. But now they are encountering a version of you who no longer needs constant reassurance from them to feel secure. You are not looking at the past in the same way anymore. You are beginning to understand that missing someone does not mean you have to return to the same pain. Loving someone does not mean you have to abandon your boundaries. And remembering what you shared does not mean you have to stop moving forward. This is why they may be thinking about you more now than before. Because your energy no longer feels like something they can automatically access. They can no longer assume that one message would bring everything back to the way it was. They can no longer be certain that you would respond with the same warmth, the same hope, or the same willingness to keep trying. And that uncertainty is forcing them to confront something they avoided for a long time. What if you really have changed? What if the person who once waited for them is no longer waiting? What if the love is still there, but the dependence is gone? Because there is a difference between losing feelings and losing access. They may be beginning to realize that you can still care about them and still choose not to return to what hurt you. You can still think about them and still continue your life. You can still miss the connection and still refuse to become the old version of yourself again. And perhaps this is what makes them hesitate. They may want to reach out, but they are afraid of what they might find on the other side of the silence. They are afraid you may have moved on. They are afraid you may no longer need an explanation. They are afraid that the person they once had access to has finally learned how to live without waiting for them to make a decision. That is the part they cannot control. Your healing is no longer dependent on their return. Your peace is no longer waiting for their apology. Your future is no longer paused until they finally understand what they should have understood before. And now, the person who once believed you would always be there may be wondering whether they waited too long. Because the truth is, your energy changed the moment you stopped asking someone else to recognize your value. And they may be feeling that change now, even from a distance. They may not know what happened inside you, but they know something is different. They can feel that you are no longer chasing the past. They can feel that you are becoming harder to reach. And somewhere deep inside, they are beginning to understand the question that scares them most. If you have finally learned how to move forward without them, then what would make you turn around now? And now we arrive at the truth they may have been avoiding from the very beginning. They are beginning to understand that you were not just someone they loved, someone they missed, or someone they could simply replace when the timing became inconvenient. You were someone who saw them, really saw them. You noticed the things they tried to hide behind confidence. You heard the things they never said directly. You recognized when their silence meant pain, when their distance meant fear, and when their strength was only a mask covering something much more fragile underneath. And perhaps they never fully understood the value of that while you were still there. Perhaps they assumed being understood was something that would always be available to them. But now, after your absence has created a space no one else seems able to fill in quite the same way, they are beginning to realize what they actually lost. Imagine searching for a key for years, trying one door after another, only to realize that the door you were desperately trying to open had already been opened by someone who was standing beside you the entire time. That is the realization slowly forming inside them. You may not have been perfect. You may have had your own fears, your own wounds, your own moments when you did not know what to say. But your connection was real in a way that is becoming harder for them to find again. You did not simply make them feel wanted. You made them feel seen. And there is a difference. Anyone can admire the version of a person that is easy to love. But you noticed the version they tried to hide. You stayed close to the parts of them they were afraid other people would reject. And now they may be realizing that losing you meant losing someone who understood the language behind their silence. This is why the memories keep returning. This is why certain moments refuse to disappear. This is why they may still wonder what you are doing, whether you think about them, whether you ever look back, whether the connection still means anything to you. They are not only missing the past, they are questioning the future they might have had if they had understood you sooner. And perhaps that is the part that hurts the most, because you may have walked away hoping they would finally understand. But now that they do, you are no longer standing in the same place, waiting for that realization to arrive. They thought your goodbye was the end of the story. They thought you were simply leaving. But they are beginning to understand that you were also becoming someone new, someone who no longer needs to beg for clarity, someone who no longer needs to chase an explanation, someone who can remember the love without returning to the pain that came with it. And this is where the entire connection changes, because if they ever come back, they will not be returning to the same person who once waited for them. They will be meeting the version of you who learned how to walk away. The version of you who discovered that love can be real and still not be enough without effort, honesty, and consistency. The version of you who finally understood that being deeply connected to someone does not mean losing yourself inside their uncertainty. So yes, they may still think about you, they may still miss you, they may still replay the moments they once took for granted. But the most important part of this story is no longer whether they finally understand why you left. The most important part is that you now understand why you had to. You walked away because a part of you knew that continuing to abandon yourself for the sake of the connection would eventually destroy the very person they once fell in love with. And perhaps this is the truth they will never be able to escape. You did not leave because the connection meant nothing. You left because it meant so much that you could no longer keep allowing it to cost you everything. Now they may finally understand your silence. They may finally understand your distance. They may finally understand that your goodbye was not a lack of love. It was the moment you chose to stop losing yourself. And the question haunting them now may not be whether you still think about them. It may be something far more painful than that. They may be wondering whether they waited too long to become the person you needed them to be.